Well, welcome to our Building a New and Better Model for Transportation breakout session. My name is Aaron Sutch. I'm the Mid-Atlantic Region Director for Solar United Neighbors. If you're not familiar with our work, Solar United Neighbors is a nonprofit organization that helps people go solar, join together, and fight for energy rights. We're a full 50-state nonprofit. We have active programs in 12 states, and I manage the Mid-Atlantic region. And I'm really happy to be joined here by a group of expert panelists, including Liza Borches, President and CEO of Cara Myers Automotive. We have Veronika Wright, a battery technology consultant and EV blogger, as well as Campblin, community development planner and environmental justice activist. So we're all going to talk a little bit about how we got into the EV space. I'm going to start off and then turn it over to our panelists. We're going to go through a series of guided questions and take perhaps some audience questions here from our live studio audience, and then wrap it up with some additional discussion. So I got started in electric vehicles in terms of my work. So what we found is that in helping people go solar, address the barriers to deploying rooftop solar on homes and businesses, what we found is that people that had solar were really interested in electric vehicles. And then we also found that people that had electric vehicles are really interested in solar. So that connection was one that was really easily made. And our work really focuses on addressing the barriers to EV or to solar adoption. So what we did is started a program that it deployed electric vehicle chargers as part of our solar deployment programs, our solar co-ops. And we found again that there was a tremendous amount of success. People that were interested in the technologies were interested in both technologies. So in terms of work, we started to actively make that program a little bit more robust and now have a lot of EV resources and are really happy to coordinate with groups such as Drive Electric, Richmond, Drive Electric RVA and Charles Groups, Generation 180, and a lot of other folks. Now, on a personal note, I have an electric vehicle myself. In 2016, I bought a Ford C-Max plug-in hybrid, and it's actually one of my favorite cars. I'm really happy about it. It's a great performance, and I will definitely never go back to gas. So I'm a big proponent of EVs and see the opportunity to fuel our transportation revolution with electric vehicles with solar. So they're very, very compatible and well adapted to each other. So that's how I got into the space. I'll turn it over to our panelists. Again, we're really happy or lucky to have a number of experts in the field. So Liza, if you wanted to tell a little bit about how you got into the EV space.
Sure. Thanks so much, Aaron. As you said, I'm Liza Borches, and I'm President and CEO of Cara Myers Automotive. And we've been in the automotive industry since 1924. I'm actually the fourth generation of my family to have the honor and privilege to run this company. But the first time that, and I guess it's important for me to mention, we're in 5 markets across Virginia, and we represent 17 different brands. So we're obviously very involved with pretty much every OEM and manufacturer who's really diving into EVs right now. But the first time I drove an EV was in 2010 when the Nissan Leaf first was introduced. And I didn't think too much of them really for a handful of years until my husband and I started getting a lot more involved around the issue of climate change and understanding that transportation is the #1 contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And we really decided, being in this industry, we had 3 choices. One, we could just keep selling a whole lot of cars, put our head in the sand and continue to just move forward in this business. 2, we could get out of the business and say we don't want to be a part of it because it's a contributor in such a massive way. Or 3, we could be a leader and pull a seat up to the table and say we need to bring the automotive industry to the table to be a solutions provider. And so that's the decision that we made. We said, if we're going to stay in this industry, we need to figure out how to move our industry quicker into the EV space. We were the first dealership in the state of Virginia to be fully powered by the sun with a solar superstructure at our Nissan dealership in Charlottesville. We both drive EVs, one in a plug-in hybrid and the other in a full EV. We do need a little bit of additional space since I drive to Winchester and Williamsburg and everywhere for work, but we have a Nissan Leaf and a Volvo XC90 plug-in hybrid. So we've been a part, I guess the last thing I'll mention, a part of the legislation that has been coming through Virginia in the past year to get the Clean Cars Act passed, as well as 2 other pieces of legislation around consumer rebates and a study for infrastructure needed for the future. So I'm very pleased to be here and look forward to working with all of you all to continue to put more EVs on the road.
Thanks, Liza. That's great. Veronica, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure, thank you. My name is Veronica Wright. I am running a social enterprise in Wisconsin called Electrified Veronica, short EV. I am working in the battery and electrification industry as a consultant. I did that before. That was the start of my career. Now I'm doing it on my own. My expertise is battery lifecycle management. So I'm really in the battery area. And a big part of what I'm doing with my company, and really also my passion, is informing and educating our society about electrification, batteries, electric vehicles, green transportation, and so on. I'm also running a YouTube channel where I share battery insights, and we also recently tested the Mustang Mach-E. We have been to the registration holder event for the Ford F-150 Lightning and could test ride it and have a look at the powertrain. So very happy to share all that with everybody who wants to follow. And one of my next projects will be electrifying a Jeep Wrangler. So I haven't owned a car yet, so this will be my first car. So really doing the whole conversion. It's a Jeep Wrangler 99 model, the one from the Gilmore Girls show, for those who know. And so we will convert it completely, fully to electric. So for everybody that wants to follow us and join this adventure, please join us on YouTube. And yeah, I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. Battery technology expert. Boy, we got some questions for you coming up. Great. And last but not least, Campblin, Community Development Planner, Environmental Justice Activist. Cara.
Hi, thank you. It's great to be here. I have a couple entry points into the whole world of EVs. And the first one started several years ago when I was a long-range planner for the city of Eustis in Florida. It's just north of Orlando, Florida. And we were developing demonstration EV charging stations around the community to kind of encourage and transitioning over to EVs for our residents, but also it was a demonstration project. And so giving up people an opportunity to become aware with the emerging technology. So as the planner for the city is just, looking at our long-range planning, and comprehensive planning documents to ensure that we had the proper codes and regulations in place in order to accommodate that. And so several years later, the National NAACP, I'm currently the Environmental and Climate Justice Committee Chair for Virginia State Conference NAACP, and National NAACP about 3 or 4 years ago held a convening on electrification and the emerging electric vehicle charging stations. And that's when we started really having that environmental justice conversation and how it will impact your frontline communities as well as the low wealth consumers, and what do we need to have in place in terms of policies and regulations and all of those things in place to ensure that there is a just transition. And then my third entry point is serving as the current co-director for Green New Deal Virginia, is making sure that the current policies that are coming and being brought and introduced to the Commonwealth are done in an equitable and just manner.
Well, great. I'm really excited to have panelists from such diverse backgrounds. So I'm going to go ahead and start with some facilitated questions. We might turn it over to the audience if they have a few too. But the first one is that multiple studies have shown that electric vehicles are more environmentally friendly. Some of those ones, probably the most famous, are the Union of Concerned Scientists, where they do a big analysis of life cycle analysis of electric vehicles compared to gas. And electric vehicles are always cleaner, even on a traditional grid, but electric vehicles are not without some sort of impact. So I'd like to discuss some of the ways in which we can make that transition to EVs as sustainable as possible, especially given the life cycle costs of the different components and the way that electricity is generated. So we don't want to exchange one set of problems for another. And so specifically, I would like to get into what are the environmental impacts of transportation electrification to consider? What is fact and what is fiction? So I think I'll turn it over to Veronica first, because it sounds like you've done some pretty extensive research in that category.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. I'm happy to share some thoughts here. So yeah, I think one of the challenges we have right now is we have this big hype and boom for electrification, electric vehicles, batteries, and related technologies. But at the same time, there is lots of uncertainties out there in our society, especially considering environmental aspects. And even for me, sometimes as a battery expert, it's hard to figure out, as you mentioned, what is fact and what is fiction. But so it's really nice to see that there are more and more investigations and reports that really compare the environmental impacts for traditional ICE cars compared to battery electric vehicles. And the nice thing is they really consider the whole life of the vehicle. So as you mentioned, we call it life cycle assessments, LCAs. So comparing emissions, especially CO2 between ICE and battery electric vehicles really along their whole lifetime. So starting from where do we get the raw materials for our components from? How do we produce components, especially the batteries for battery electric vehicles? How do we produce the vehicles? And then once we have them on the road, how do we charge them compared to refueling? And also what happens to them at end of life? How efficient is recycling? So all of that is considered in these investigations. And as you mentioned, it's very regional analysis, actually. So it really depends on where you look at that in the world. There are regions in the world where from an environmental standpoint, it makes really a lot of sense to go fully electric right now, even like 100%. So I'm actually from Austria, and we have 80% renewable energies in Austria. And, you know, charging a vehicle in Austria produces really way less emissions than obviously the direct combustion of an ICE. But if I now compare that to Wisconsin, so where I live now, right now we have 10 to 15% renewable energies, which means we have a certain contribution while charging vehicles. So it's very regional analysis. Nice to see that more and more, but you know, we're just at the beginning right now. We will invest into infrastructures and renewables in the electrification area to make transportation even more environmentally friendly.
Anything to add, Karen or Liza? I think Veronica covered it pretty well. So the next question is kind of related. What happens or what needs to happen to ensure that electric vehicles have the maximum impact on climate change and air pollution? And I don't know, Veronica, if you have something, but I wanted to start with a point that I think needs to be mentioned, is that we have to consider where our electric vehicles are fueled from. What type of grid? What is the energy mix? Is it zero carbon? Is it renewable? And so that's pretty easy to make that connection. But one thing I think it's hard for people to realize is that the grid is also not static, which means there's different types of energy mixes during certain times. So say during peak demand here in Richmond, we have actually two periods of peak demand. On a hot summer afternoon when it's over 90 degrees, everybody's cranking their air conditioners. And then in the winter on a very cold morning when people are using their electric resistance heater. And those are typically times when the grid is much dirtier because the utility has to fire up dirtier and more expensive power generation. So here in Richmond or in Virginia, Dominion is about 30 to 40% carbon free for the most part. But during those peak times, it's actually much dirtier because they have to use dirtier generation fuels, fossil fuels. So one thing that I think that could be helpful to consider is when vehicles are charged. So a good example is Dominion actually rolled out an off-peak type of program which incentivizes people to charge during off-peak times when the grid is actually cleaner and electricity is cheaper and more abundant. And Solar United Neighbors is actually happy to do a webinar with that. But I think it starts having people think about the grid as dynamic in terms of time. And then as the technology gets better, we're able to have a two-way grid where there's vehicle to grid technology. So I just wanted to make that point. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add in terms of the impact on climate change and air pollution, but turning it over to you all.
Aaron, I'll just make a small mention to tag on to something that you just shared. It had been shared with me that even though the EVs today might be plugging into infrastructure that may not be as clean as we would like based on where that electricity is coming from, it is a different problem for us to solve, a more centralized problem for us to solve long-term versus a localized problem with every individual vehicle emitting emissions the way it is right now. So even though we haven't solved the entire problem, as we move towards EVs, then we start focusing on the increase in renewables around our overall charging infrastructure. The other thing that I'll mention, and this is just a small thing, but from the industry that I'm in, every EV also is able to be programmed to only charge at certain times. So for example, we have our Nissan Leaf set up so it only charges from 12 at night until 6 a.m. So while my husband might pull in at 5 in the afternoon and plug it in so that it's prepared, it's going to wait and utilize energy when it's more effective. And so we need to do a great job as the industry in educating our consumers when they buy these vehicles, how they can also be more responsible on when and how they charge.
Yeah, that really is a great point. You know, even the dirtiest grids are always getting cleaner, right? And if you can charge at a time when it's off peak and it's mostly renewable or non-carbon, you can actually have that agency to make that change yourself. That's a great point.
I'd like to just add a little bit on this before we move on, and it may even be segueing over to what we're moving on to, but and that's just dealing with some, as we know, it's an emerging technology and things are currently still in flux, and we're coming up with new and improved ways of handling the particularly the batteries. But as we move forward with transitioning over with to EVs, just ensuring that we are very considerate and cognizant of some of the unintended consequences. So in terms of creating these batteries and the extraction of the critical elements that are needed, having consideration as to the communities, the frontline communities, and even some of the other countries outside of the United States of how those extractions for these metals are going to impact those communities and those countries. And also, continual in the line of the research and development in which it's trying to figure out how best to either dispose of discarded batteries of a less amount, so we have less in our landfills, and be able to have a better waste management system associated with these discarded batteries, but also encouraging recycling. And most importantly, and I think this is the newer piece of it, is the reuse. So trying to find that second life for the battery. And so whether it be a standalone electric infrastructure system or something like that. And I think, as we move forward and everybody starts to buy EVs, yay, that we try to function and operate in those last two bits, less disposal and more reuse and recycling. And I think that would help not only with the climate, but also with air pollution. And then also with those processes to do those things, we also have to make sure that we're not moving from one different type of air pollution from the combustion energies to another type of air pollution when we're coming up with those reuse and recycling techniques.
Yeah, I think that's great. It really segues into the next point. What are the opportunities to make the supply chain cleaner? You mentioned EV batteries that could be resurfaced or repurposed, right? So maybe an EV battery has 70 or 60% of its lifespan left. If it's a big battery, that could be used as a standalone storage, right? And I'm wondering if Liza or Veronica have any other ideas about that, or if there's things that they see in terms of supply chain. That's an end of use example, but you talked, Karen, about the extraction and being mindful about frontline communities. What else can we do?
So in my work, in my consultancy, I'm really trying to have a look at the big picture. I call it the battery biography. So really battery birth, rebirth and reincarnation. So I think there are several ways we can improve the current supply chain. So for me, it's, as you mentioned, use green energy in all phases along the battery life. A second thing, as we mentioned also, is optimizing the reusability of materials after first life for second life application. Now we can address what you mentioned, grid variations with stationary energy storage systems made of used batteries, and of course recycling. And then one point we didn't mention so far is optimizing the transportation chain. So I recently looked into where Tesla is getting their batteries from. And if you have a look at the transportation chain, you see that, for example, lithium, so one of the raw materials, is mined in Africa. Then it's shipped to Asia for post-processing. Then the cathodes are produced in Japan, and then everything goes back to, or goes to US for producing the battery. And the nice thing is that lots of OEMs and battery manufacturers are addressing that problem and really optimizing the transportation chain, making it more local, extracting materials where you produce the products and stuff like that.
That's a great point. All really good points. And what I would also add, kind of before we move on to the next, is that we talk about the concern for life cycle and batteries. Batteries can always get cleaner. Petroleum transportation fuel is always going to stay dirty. And I think some of the people that push back, or some of the interests that push back on electrification, use some of those talking points. We always have to remember that this is something that we're mindful of. There's a lot of technologies that we're going to help us make that transition cleaner in terms of the environment. And I think that tees up the next point, which is discussing some of the socioeconomic ramifications and opportunities. We can't just look at this transportation change as something that happens in a vacuum. So we have to look at how the opportunities affect the communities. So what are the impacts of this transition on the production and sale and servicing of automobiles to consider? Because a lot of people are employed in that sector. So I think Liza would be well positioned to talk about that.
Sure. There are so many parts to this topic. Some things that come to mind, the transition of inventory as we go from internal combustion engine vehicles into EVs. It's going to happen over quite a few years, but there's going to be a lot of impact from that inventory transition, both from the manufacturers all the way through to the dealerships. But the piece of it that I see as the biggest impact socioeconomically is actually the vehicle values as we transition through this time. What we're seeing right now is that EVs are having a harder time with their residuals and depreciating faster because that technology is changing so quickly right now that they're not holding their values as much as we would expect. But down the road, we're going to have the opposite problem. We're going to have people coming out of ICE vehicles going into EVs, and the ICE vehicles are going to start dropping in value quicker. And we're going to have to figure out how to transition customers in an effective way with them still having some value in the vehicle they're trading in as they move from an ICE vehicle to an EV. So there's a lot that we could unpack there, but it's something really important to be top of mind for us. Some other impacts that we certainly are going to see is in the service intervals and the types of maintenance that consumers are going to need. There's a lot of studies out there that show that EVs do go through tires and brakes and some of those common wear pieces quicker than ICE vehicles, but there's so many other components of the vehicle that will have a significantly longer life. And so we're going to have to transition the types of parts that are being supplied, the types of parts that are in dealerships that are prepared for consumers. There's a significant investment around both training for future technicians, significant investment in equipment and tools that will be needed in all servicing facilities. And we're already seeing that today. I mean, we're starting in each of our dealerships, a couple $100,000 in each one this year, just to start being prepared for those first EVs that are going to be coming in maintenance intervals in any sort of volume. I would venture to say that the sales side is the least impacted. It's going to be the service and parts side that we will see the biggest, both supply chain, production, and ultimately impact in the dealerships and on the workforce. We need to have technical schools that are prepared to be able to invest in these future technicians. And the last comment on the sales side that I will mention is we've got to make sure that the sales consultants who are working with our consumers are not just properly educated on the product, but on helping consumers understand how EVs can fit into their lifestyle and walking them through what that change would be in their life. So we've got to retrain our sales associates to not just be product focused, but understanding great questions on how to guide a consumer through a lifestyle change.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm actually going to piggyback ahead because it relates. What are the education and workforce development needs? What does that training look like? What are the specifics? So, Veronica was slated to talk about that, but maybe Liza or Karen, what type of specific trainings and transitions are we going to need specific to the workforce?
I'll start first and then pass it off because I think they'll have a different direction to take it. But on the technician side, I mean, that's the most important part for us from a training perspective. We already have certified technicians in each of our dealerships to work on EVs. But where I'm seeing the bigger challenge, as I started to mention earlier, it's in the technical schools that start in high school and in college. Most of those schools right now are training students on old vehicles because that's what their budget allows for. That's what's being given to them and what they can afford. We have got to find a way to get the new technology into the hands of these schools so that the future technicians are coming up down that path and not learning on a 2003 Ford Taurus. But someone's got to make that dollar investment. And I envision down the road, we will for years almost have two shops. So we're going to have a half a shop working on EVs and another group of technicians working on ICE vehicles. And then those will start becoming less and less balanced over the years. But investing in our technical schools with the new technology is going to be critical.
I can very much relate to what you're saying. So you mentioned before, this transition happens so fast, happens right now, and nobody really seems to be prepared for that. And there is a lack in educated people. I noticed that myself right now that I started my consultancy, and there is a negative unemployment rate for people that know about batteries and battery technology. So we need more people that are educated. I agree, it starts at the technical school level. Even before then, I was recently involved with an elementary school in Canada, and actually in their curriculum, they don't have renewable energies. They don't learn about solar batteries or anything like that. So they still learn about how to burn coal. So really at this very early stage, this needs to be addressed as well. And then if I look at universities, I didn't learn anything about electric vehicles, batteries, or anything like that. I studied technical physics. I think we also need to work on that. Then for the technicians, workshops, dealerships, I think there must be trainings for high voltage. Obviously, this is normally not the case. And also in the recycling area. And overall, I think this industry will need stronger education in software, firmware, electrochemistry. So this was not the case before in the automotive industry.
And then I would jump in, and I think somebody said this earlier, in which we should try and encourage more domestic manufacturing. And so, speaking of how these products are going to be manufactured within the United States, we're going to have to anticipate that some of these existing factories are going to need some type of retrofitting. So it's going to have to involve clear communication with existing employees of these transitions, these new certifications, and the process has to be very transparent and communicated early enough to our existing workers to be able to get the right certification and training that they need when it's needed, right? And so going through labor unions, they have a lot of apprentice programs and on-the-job training opportunities. And so, promoting domestic manufacturing with labor unions and labor jobs is another way. And then, of course, I agree with everything that has been said before, encouraging our students to pursue these subjects while they're in high schools and colleges, as well as making sure that we can get the resources to these existing training facilities within our academic institutions to make sure that they are practicing and training on the right equipment. But we will still have those fossil and carbon-based type automobiles for some time as well. So we still need to have those in the mix as well. And then also finally, just making sure that as we're transitioning over to EVs, that we're still promoting, living wages as well as the training sources, training opportunities to be competitive in the new industry in the sector.
Yeah, this is great. I'm hearing a lot of really good focus on the solutions, right? So that's a great kind of focus on, there's some challenges, but we've got a lot of solutions. And personally, I come from an education background, and some of the points that Veronica and you, Karen, mentioned, just about having kids have access to an electric vehicle. Now we're seeing a lot more solar in schools, thanks to the work of a lot of different people. So kids can see solar panels and even incorporate them into the curriculum. So STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, with electric vehicles, having kids having access to that and using it as part of the curriculum seems to be a great opportunity. And I think it will filter up into the trades, into unions, into all of the different supply chains. So a lot of great focus on solutions to the problems. I think they're going to set up our next question, which is looking into the future. So let's just say we are 100% successful. We will be, it's just a matter of time, but we're 100% successful at getting a bunch of electric vehicles out into the world in a sustainable, equitable manner. What needs to happen to ensure the benefits of transportation electrification are available to as many people as possible? So what are the current obstacles and opportunities? And I think I will start with you, Karen.
Oh, great. Fantastic. I think there are a lot of different, and we already started having that conversation during this panel, but some of the other things that we would need to make sure that everyone is able to transition and benefit from transportation electrification would be ensuring equitable distribution of the charging infrastructure, making sure that these infrastructures are not placed only in affluent communities and places that are really hard to be able to get to. And also ensuring that safety is a priority as well. So making sure that these charging infrastructure are in places where, a single rider at a particular time of day is able to pull over and charge their vehicle. So we're seeing a lot of repurposing that's going on right now. We're seeing electric charging stations appearing in malls and places with high activity to ensure safety. And then also making sure that there's some kind of funding structure that is going to support communities of low wealth, whether it's there's a lot of conversation and discussions about EV rebates, but we have to make sure that these EV rebates are enhanced to provide additional support and resources to communities of low wealth, right? And then also making sure that as we're creating those funding structures for expanding our charging infrastructure, that the cost does not go back to the utility ratepayer. So we have to make sure that our financing mechanism does not fall on the burden of the customers or a member owner, depending on where they are situated.
Veronica or Liza, do you have anything to add?
I'll just mention a couple things to piggyback on what Karen just said. When we talk about how do we make sure that that EVs are accessible to all, charging infrastructure is definitely a big part of it, and making sure that in rental housing, in apartment complexes, the majority of EV owners, when you look at the data, they charge at home and at work. So it's great to have it in these other areas, but we've got to make sure. I think Maryland is one state that has done a great job with rebates specifically for home charging infrastructure, and in working with housing that multi-dwelling housing to make sure that we are incentivizing them to put EVs in place. The only other comment that I'll mention is around in the state of Virginia, we just put together a rebate bill, and we did put two elements in there that were specific to this question. One, there's a larger rebate for families under a certain income level. That was an important piece of it. And then the other thing that we really studied as we were putting together that bill was how many EVs does it take to put on the road new in order for us to have a good flow into the pre-owned market? Because we know that we've got to have a certain price point on a vehicle for someone to get a $200 or $250 payment per month that can fit into a budget. And so it is really important that we're driving new EV sales so that we can have a well-rounded EV market that's accessible to everyone.
For me, maybe just something to add, but you also mentioned that before, is getting energy companies on board. Like the transportation sector needs to be 100% incorporated in the energy sector. Like, and we will see completely new business models that we didn't have before. All of these stakeholders around batteries, electrification, they're right now trying to figure out, hey, what is my role in this future market and industry? I think it's really, really interesting to see that. For example, also, so if I want to spend money to put a charging station in front of my house and publish it, people can stop by, and I could make money from providing energy for them to charge the vehicles. And especially if it's powered from my home solar and battery energy storage solution, I think this would be great. And these could be completely new business models that we see in the future.
Yeah, and a few things that you said really stood out. In our work with solar deployment, we're always looking at the practical barriers. And so when somebody talks to me, I'm like, well, is you have a good roof? Do you own your own house? And it started me thinking about the barriers to charging an electric vehicle, right? And so two things came up. If you live in a multi-family apartment, so for example, my ex-wife is looking for a new car. And I don't know if I'm the best person to try to convince her of anything, but I tried to convince her to buy an electric vehicle. And the first thing she said, well, I live in an apartment. And I said, well, yeah, that's almost a deal breaker, right? Because most of the people per what was said, the data I think Liza mentioned, is that the majority of people are going to charge at home. The second part is that somebody may own their own house or not live in a multifamily, but only have access to on-street parking, right? So they don't have a garage. So these are serious barriers. And I guess the last part of this, and I might turn it over to some audience questions, is are there any ways to reduce some of the higher upfront costs of EVs related to charging infrastructure so people can stand to benefit from the lower maintenance? I don't know if we covered all that, but really it's about making sure that that charging infrastructure is available no matter what type of dwelling somebody lives in. So if there's any last thoughts from the panelists on that.
I think there's a pretty simple solution to that that has been bubbling up, but we haven't necessarily put fully together. And that is just making sure that charging infrastructure can be a part of the purchase or lease price for a consumer. We've talked to a couple of charging companies to figure out how we can make that happen so that it is rolled into the purchase price. It can be financed and just added to monthly payment versus having an upfront investment made, as well as making sure that there's some sort of maintenance agreement or warranty on that charger that's included. I don't think it's a difficult solution that we need to find. It's there. We just got to make it happen.
Any other thoughts? What about ride sharing? I thought, electric ride sharing, is there any opportunities for that? I'm throwing it out there for the panel just as something ad hoc. But, I thought, in Richmond, it would be a great opportunity if there was some way to subsidize some type of electric car sharing or electric ride sharing. But don't know if you all have some thoughts on that.
So I've recently visited Austria, my home country again, and they have so much car sharing there in every major city. So one example would be Vienna, where I tried the system. They have hundreds of Tesla Model 3 there, and it was so easy to do that, and it was so amazing. You use the app and you can just go ahead and rent the car for a couple of hours or for however long you need it. You can park for free in the city. You can charge for free. It was such an amazing experience. We do not have that too much in US yet, but I see some, for example, Minneapolis, I think will have car sharing soon. So I see a potential in some regions of the world for car sharing, electric car sharing.
One of the best parts about that would be the data is clear that as soon as a consumer rides or drives in an EV, their whole mentality around the potential future of owning an EV changes. So just by
Yeah.
having them offered as a ride share, we know that we're going to be able to grow more market share and more people considering an EV.
Yeah, and just to also support what you're saying, I invested $50 and I could really feel what it means to own an EV for a couple hours. That was amazing.
I don't know if this fits in with your question, but I would also, emphasize encouraging fleet electrification, your medium and heavy trucks, as well as discouraging additional purchases of diesel school buses and getting electric vehicle school buses. So also looking at, things other than the single occupancy vehicles. And then, in terms of air pollution and trying to improve air quality, making sure that our public buses are also, electric, but also encouraging public transport, even though it's not, but, also encouraging public transit usage and expansion of that as well.
Yeah, great points. Two things. Yeah, definitely the opportunity for fleet electrification, as well as the fact that people that drive electric vehicles like them. I like to say it's like back in the old days, switching from gas to electric is like switching from a fax machine to a computer. It's just better technology on every single front. So yeah, I think some of those solutions are certainly hold a lot of promise. Before we get to the last question, it's going to be a little bit of a free forum on public policy. Wanted to see if there's any questions from our studio audience. Gentleman in the orange. And you're going to have to speak really loud. Yes, sir.
This may be a question that may have been asked earlier, but what about insurance for electric vehicles? What is a reasonable range that we can expect for insurers to apply towards an electric vehicle?
So what is a reasonable range? What are the insurance considerations for an electric vehicle? I can tell you that when my electric vehicle, I just paid my regular insurance. I didn't see any jump in premium, but panelists, do you have any thoughts on that?
So typically what I see is that the warranty for electric vehicles is 8 years and 100,000 miles or more. And I think business models for insurance companies will be very, very interesting in the future. And now I'm having my tech hat on. So I was involved in, writing algorithms to predict battery lifetime according how to use it. And from this work, you see that it's actually not solely about the number of miles you're driving, but really it is about how you're using the battery, the electric vehicle, how often are you charging, at which temperatures and stuff like that. So what I see happening in the insurance industry and what I also get somehow requests for is probably we can't handle it like an ICE car where we just look at the mileage and number of driven miles, but really maybe we need to look at how did we use the battery to make sure we can insure it. So that's kind of interesting, I think.
I think the other piece that comes up with insurance is when an electric vehicle is in an accident, what is the potential liability of an insurance company for an EV versus an internal combustion engine vehicle? And right now, I don't believe the data shows that there's a significant difference in what the insurance cost is on an EV versus an ICE vehicle, but they also don't have enough large amount of data of EVs on the road that have been in those situations. We do know that from a parts perspective, depending on what's damaged, it could be potentially more expensive on an EV, depending on where the accident is. But from everything I've read so far, there's not enough data out there to really have any significant difference in insurance costs of one vehicle versus the other.
Great. That's a great question.
So that means you just as a follow-up. So you said you didn't see much of an increase in your standard insurances.
Yeah.
So it's about the same. So you go from 500 to 1,000 a year.
As an example, if I may, our nationwide policy for Prius was higher than for our Tesla.
Okay. My insurance went up because the value of my car went up.
Because of the safety and
When I bought it.
reliability issues.
I'll say this also varies between carriers greatly.
Yes.
So we have had Chevy Bolts for years through Geico, and it was very competitive with any other car that we've ever owned. But when we bought a Tesla, Geico charged significantly more because we bought a Tesla. But when we went to shop other carriers, it was exactly the same as when it was with our Bolts. So certain carriers tend to charge more for certain types of electric vehicles, it seems. I guess because Teslas are more expensive, it also is a cost-based thing. Right, so we went to Travelers Insurance, but it was also competitive with Progressive. Both of those companies were significantly less than Geico, even though it's the same exact car.
So what I'm hearing
you
is
gotta shop around.
shop around, right? Same thing with solar and homeowners insurance. Most of them will not charge a premium, but if they do, we say find another company. So it's a great. John, in the green, question.
First of all, I'm all in on EVs. I had one of the
You're gonna have to
first
speak
Volts
up.
and one of the last Volts. I'll never own a car without a plug. I have my solar array that I got through Aaron's program about 4 years ago. But a couple of, I could ask lots of questions, but I'll stick to two. Sourcing of materials for electric vehicles. Not just the ethical issues, cobalt and child labor and whatnot. That's something we've heard about. But do we have enough materials when we ramp up 100-fold with lithium, copper, cobalt, neodymium? I hear people talk about things like that. So that's one question. Secondly, I haven't heard mentioned the big picture. One of the issues with renewable energy is, of course, the intermittency. And many people have talked for years about the idea of EVs helping with that, with vehicle to grid or vehicle to home, having it be bi-directional. We have all these giant batteries in our cars. Can we help smooth out the electrical supply? Where does that stand? I haven't heard much in the way of development in that area. Thank you.
Well, first, all really great questions. So we'll start with the first one. Is there enough materials? Ron? When we go 100% full all electric, do we have enough of those raw materials out there?
You want to have a yes, no answer? So it's very interesting space. And this is always the first question that you will get if you're working in the battery area. You know, we are looking into different battery technologies. Most of them right now are nickel based. Also, a Tesla used to be nickel based. And of course, we have a certain amount of lithium, but it's actually less. We see big battery manufacturers and automakers shifting from nickel-based NMC chemistry towards iron-based LFP because of the accessibility to raw materials. The question, do we have enough raw materials, also includes, are we mining enough? Did we look into mining and invest into mining these materials? Just one example that surprised me a lot is recently they found a big lithium, lots of lithium in my home country. Like this could supply all Europe for the next time. So it's really about, we need to invest into mining the right materials. Then we see diversification and people and companies looking into battery technologies where we have more materials available. And a third thing is recycling. So heavy investments into recycling right now to really get these materials back.
I would add, it may not answer the question entirely, but I would throw caution that we don't really look at it as, do we have enough of these elements to create the batteries, but what can we actually extract while still being responsible to the adjacent communities and to our natural environment. And so I think there's going to be some point where we do identify these elements, especially the ones that are extractive, where we may have to say, we cannot do it. We cannot take this source from this location. And we should be okay with saying that and finding a different source. And I think with what we've been discussing is that there's a lot of research and development that's going on, and hopefully we can move to a less extractive process in order to get the elements for these batteries. But I don't think we should rely on, we will just have enough these minerals and elements for the batteries. We really need to be looking for another source at this time.
Those are really great points. So I think the answer is yes, but with some caveats. I would also mention too that, you know, we're looking at lithium ion, and as Veronica mentioned, there's different chemistries. So who's not to say that, you know, lithium seems to be the belle of the ball right now in terms of deployment. But per the point that you made, Karen, is, you know, with a lot of research and development, maybe that looks a lot different in 10 years with the different battery chemistries. And the last part of your question, and then we'll leave a little bit of time just to talk about some take homes of impactful policy in the public arena, vehicle to grid technology. So I think I can take that. What we're seeing, of course, with the revolution in electric vehicles as well as solar, the grid is becoming more distributed, less centralized, and that people are now becoming interactive players in that. So in some utility markets, they're starting to roll out some of those vehicle to grid, basically where vehicles backfeed the grid or supply some sort of power. And as I mentioned before, that could be a real, a great asset to reduce peak demand and to kind of manage on-site solar and all sorts of different things. So I think the take-home message is that certainly coming, although it is really in the pilot phase right now. And you know, the technology is starting to get there, but it's not widespread at this point. I think it holds a lot of promise. I think the new Ford F-150, for example, the Lightning, you know, you're able to actually charge some of your home appliances. And I know, I think in some old Nissan Leafs or maybe current Nissan Leafs, people were able to use that as a battery generator. So that's the, for their homes. So that's, I think, the start of it, and it'll only continue to get more robust. Any other thoughts on that? Okay, well, we have a couple minutes left, and I just wanted to focus lastly on what might be one of the most impactful public policies, maybe on the federal, state, or local level. Turn that over to our panelists. I will say, I will just start off that in solar, what we've found is that a lot of the barriers that can be significant barriers happen on the local level. And I'll just tell you an example. We passed a legislation that made it harder for homeowners associations to prohibit solar on their dwellings. So I just urge in the EV space, you know, it doesn't have to be a big policy in terms of national or federal initiatives or even global. Some of these can also be on the local level. And I know in the 2020 session that there was a piece of legislation that made it harder for homeowners associations to block EV installation of chargers in their communities. So, you know, thinking on all different levels, I'll turn it over to panelists. Anybody have some thoughts on what might be a really impactful policy for EVs?
I'll mention three quick comments. First, on the federal side, what we're seeing in our industry is there is a big challenge for the manufacturers when they have a state-by-state decision on Clean Car Acts for a CARB, for example. And if we had one standard across the country, I am fully confident we could drive costs down quicker in order to allow EVs to be on the same price point as ICE vehicles. And so it is a challenge for the manufacturers when they have to work the state by state. So that's number one. We need a federal standard that is going to move us forward faster. The second thing that I'll mention is in the state of Virginia, as I said last year, we passed several pieces of legislation. One, continuing to focus rebates and incentives specifically for families or individuals below a certain income level, so that we're actually incentivizing the people who couldn't afford an EV otherwise, I think is a very important piece of public policy. Unfortunately, we got that law passed in Virginia, and then we didn't get it funded. So there's no dollars behind it. And that is, to be honest, I haven't been in the public policy space long enough to understand that happens often. We were so excited to get it passed, and then, okay, we can't do anything now. And then the last thing that I would love to figure out how to make a reality, the old cash for clunkers idea that happened quite a few years ago. Ultimately, we need to get the ICE vehicles off the road. So not only do we want to drive more EVs on the road, but we need to get the older, highest polluting vehicles off the road. And if we had some sort of policy around kind of a cash for clunkers so that we weren't just putting those vehicles back into someone else's hands, but we're actually getting them off the road, that would make significant impact.
I would say I have a long list of items, but I would say in order for us to be able to transition in an equitable manner, there are a few things that would need to happen. And so it would be developing model building codes. We talked about that earlier for electrification, making sure that our charging infrastructure has the adequate funding, but it's also distributed in a an equitable manner, ensuring that we have fleet electrification, and as well. And I also mentioned the EV rebate with the enhancement for low-income drivers, and then of course making sure that we have a robust air quality monitoring system in place here in Virginia. Particularly in the frontline communities, to ensure that as we're transitioning over to EVs, that the infrastructure is also being updated and improved in frontline communities, in which they too are experiencing the benefits, the air quality benefits associated with this sector.
So I do not have too much knowledge actually about the public policy in US because I just arrived here, but I will need to look into that right now. And now I can only talk about my personal experience. Now I'm looking into electrifying a Jeep here in Wisconsin, and I need to understand, hey, which regulations are there? I noticed that this is very different from state to state, very local. What does it mean? What do I need to do to legalize a converted car? Liza, you were mentioning about getting rid of ICE cars on the road. I think there is a potential for EV conversions. I'm really wondering how big the market would be to take these old vehicles and make basic conversions and somehow thereby help electrifying the world.
I love
this
that
country. There are more and more companies, especially here in the US, looking into this and hear about public policy and this. I know in Austria, it's really, really hard to legalize a conversion. So it's almost not possible right now. So there needs to be a lot of changes, but I think it's easier here in the US than, for example, I was surprised in Wisconsin, you have to pay a vehicle tax of $100. It's not a lot per year when you have an electric car because you don't buy gas. This was surprising for me too. So I'm talking more on a personal level, getting involved in these projects, also installing solar and battery stationary energy systems in my house. What do I need to do? So I am exploring that right now.
I actually, I just wanted to interrupt really quickly. I forgot one piece that would need to happen in order to ensure equity and a just transition is in property right protection. So we're seeing a lot of indigenous lands and lands, minority-owned lands that are taken for mining and extraction practices. So how do we protect the lands that are owned by BIPOC communities? And that is something that needs to be addressed both on a state level within Virginia, and also it would be great if there's a federal policy that promotes that as well. And so I just wanted to do a really quick shameless plug with the Green New Deal Virginia Coalition, and co-director Lee Williams is in the audience. Hi, Lee. We are going to be doing our initial legislative policy launch on September 29th, and it's going to be streamlined on Facebook. And so we're going to be talking about some of these discussions that we even have here today, along with others.
Great. And what I'm hearing in the policy arena is there's a lot of different ways. As Liza mentioned, there's an opportunity to unify some of the federal standards, like cash for clunkers, there's a lot of different landscapes in terms of the state. Of course, we're here in Virginia, and there's different, pieces of legislation, air quality, frontline communities, as well as ensuring that some of those areas are not continually exploited. I'd like to end with a sincere thank you to our panelists, Karen, Veronica, and Liza. And if you all maybe just had a quick 10-second final thought or message for the audience and for the group before we conclude, starting with Liza. Putting you on the spot.
I love being put on the spot. No, I'm just really thrilled that you all put on this event today. Education, bringing awareness, creating top of mind thinking around EVs and how that can fit into consumers' lifestyles, and then ultimately wrapping it with the package with public policy and so many of the ideas that were shared today. I just thank you all for putting this together. It's super important that we continue to talk about this in our everyday conversation. And I'll leave you with, I can't wait to follow Veronica's journey on YouTube. We are also a Jeep dealer, and I own a 1982 Jeep Scrambler that I'm going to watch and see how you're doing it to see if I can figure it out too. Thank you.
Thank you. Veronica.
Yeah, thank you so much for organizing. I really enjoyed this discussion, especially I think we in the panel were very complimentary. That was kind of a nice fit and match. Thank you so much. I'm so passionate about electrification and batteries. This is sometimes a little bit overwhelming. I'm so happy to share everything that I'm doing and also to support the industry. It's so exciting to be in this industry right now, also because there is so much uncertainty. I love being in there, and yeah, I'm looking forward to more and more of these kind of events and sharing knowledge, know-how. Thank you.
Karen.
It was great. Thank you so much for having me here today. It was, as everyone said, it was a very robust and dynamic conversation, and I think it needs to have different viewpoints as we move forward in transition. This is gonna, we're actually defining what this new industry and sector is going to look like, and if we want to make sure that it's done right and everybody is able to participate, and we do positive changes that will influence climate change and make sure that everybody's able to participate. And the only way we can do that is by everybody being at the table. So this was a great discussion where we had different viewpoints, but we were all going for the same end goal, end game, and working together and collaborate. So I look forward to continued conversations with everyone here. So thank you.
Thank you again. I also share that the gratitude for the excellent discussion and all the different backgrounds. And I think that's the spirit of EV electrification, right? That it's an emerging industry and we're all working in different facets. So just on behalf of our organization, Solar United Neighbors, it's been a pleasure to host this. And I wanted to thank you, Charles Jarina, somewhere in the audience, if not, or maybe online, for organizing such a wonderful event. Thank you, audience, for excellent questions. Thank you.